Before we go too far tonight, get comfortable. There is nowhere you need to be for the next little while, and nothing here requires your full attention. You can listen closely if you want to. You can let your mind wander if you prefer. Either works. And if you enjoy these long journeys into the stranger corners of the past, you can leave a like, subscribe, or tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always find that strangely comforting. Knowing that while one person is listening in the middle of the afternoon in California, someone else is hearing the same words in a dark room in London or Dubai, or somewhere far quieter than either of those places. But tonight, wherever you are, I want you to imagine a hill, not a pyramid, not a ruined city, not a tomb, just a low, rounded hill rising from the dry landscape of southeastern Anatolia. For thousands of years, people passed it without knowing what was underneath. Shepherds walked over it. Animals grazed across it. Rain fell on it. Wind carried dust over it. Grass grew and died and grew again. Generations came and disappeared. Kingdoms rose elsewhere. Cities were built. Languages were invented. Religions appeared and vanished. And the hill remained. Quiet, ordinary, almost aggressively ordinary. Which is perhaps the first strange thing about Göbekli Tepe. Because beneath that unremarkable hill were enormous carved pillars, carefully arranged stone enclosures, images of dangerous animals, fragments of human bone, and structures made by people living more than 11,000 years ago. And for a long time, archaeologists believed that after building all of this, the people who used Göbekli Tepe deliberately covered it again. Not casually abandoned it, not simply walked away, covered it, filled it, buried it, which leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Why? It is easy to build something. Well, perhaps not something involving 8-ton stone pillars and no cranes. That part is admittedly inconvenient, but the idea of building is familiar to us. You build something because you want it. A house, a wall, a monument, a place to gather, a place to remember. But deliberately burying something you spent enormous effort creating feels different. If you no longer need a house, you leave it. If a building becomes inconvenient, you reuse the stones. If a structure becomes damaged, you repair it or abandon it. You do not normally spend additional labor covering the entire thing with rubble, unless the covering itself matters. And that is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because we are dealing with people who left us no written explanation. No inscription saying, "We built this because..." No tablet saying, "Today we closed the great enclosure because..." No priest complaining about the budget. No exhausted worker scratching into a wall that he had been moving rocks for 16 days and would very much like to go home. Nothing, only stone. And stone is patient. It will wait thousands of years without explaining itself. Imagine the landscape long before the hill looked the way it does today. The air would have been cleaner, certainly, although probably not in the romantic way we sometimes imagine prehistoric air. Cleaner does not mean pleasant. There would have been smoke, animal smell, sweat, blood from butchering, wet hides, old food, human waste, dust, and, depending on where you were standing, possibly the distinctive aroma of several dozen people who had not recently encountered the concept of a shower. The past is beautiful from a safe distance. Up close, it had smells. The people moving across this landscape were living before pottery became common in the region, before metal tools, before written records, before cities as we understand them. And yet someone looked at large slabs of limestone and decided that they should become something else. That decision alone is worth lingering over, because before a pillar becomes a pillar, it is simply part of the ground. Someone has to imagine removing it. Someone has to know where to cut. Someone has to organize the work. Someone has to persuade other people that spending a great deal of time striking limestone is a sensible use of daylight. And this is where our modern language becomes a little useless. We want a project manager, a foreman, a priest, a chief, a king. We want somebody wearing the prehistoric equivalent of a badge. But we do not know who organized the work. Perhaps leadership was temporary. Perhaps one person was respected because they understood stone, another because they knew rituals, another because they knew where animals would migrate, another because they had the useful social skill of convincing 30 tired people that moving a limestone pillar uphill was somehow in everyone's best interest. Humanity has always required that person. We simply do not know what they were called. Now imagine the work itself. The limestone is pale beneath the sun. You strike it. Again, again, again. Tiny fragments break away. Dust settles on your arms. The muscles in your forearms begin to ache. You change position. Your back hurts. Someone nearby is doing the same thing. The sound repeats. Stone against stone. Stone against stone. Stone against stone. There is no machine noise to cover it. No engine. No electric drill. Just the rhythm of bodies working. Perhaps people talk while they work. Perhaps they joke. Perhaps they complain. Someone is almost certainly complaining. That part of human history probably required no invention. Someone is hungry. Someone has a blister. Someone thinks the person beside them is working too slowly. Someone has been assigned to fetch water and has not returned. Someone else is quietly wondering why the pillar needs to be quite this large. And eventually, after all that work, a shape begins to emerge. A T, broad at the top, long through the body, simple from a distance. But some of the pillars are not simply geometric. They have arms, hands, belts, clothing, or loincloth-like details. They seem to be bodies, very tall bodies, bodies made of stone, and they have no faces. This is where I want you to slow down for a moment, because today we see photographs of Göbekli Tepe in bright daylight, visitors walking around, protective roofing, signs, railings, tour guides, cameras. The pillars look archaeological, and archaeology is reassuring. It puts strange things behind ropes. But remove all of that. Remove modern daylight photography. Remove the explanatory signs. Remove everything that tells your brain, this is a historical site. Now place yourself inside one of those enclosures when it was new. The walls rise around you. The central pillars stand above you. They are far larger than a person. Their proportions are human enough to be recognized. But there is no face to meet. No eyes. No mouth. No expression. Only presence. And if the structure was roofed, or partly roofed, as some researchers have considered possible, then light becomes important. Firelight does not illuminate things evenly. It reveals them in pieces. A hand appears, then vanishes. A carved fox catches light, then disappears. The edge of a pillar brightens. A shadow moves behind it. Nothing has actually moved. But your eyes are not very interested in that distinction, especially at night. Night in the ancient world is difficult for us to reconstruct emotionally because we rarely experience true darkness anymore. Even far from a city, there is often some artificial glow. A road, a house, a distant tower, a phone screen, a little green light on an appliance that no one remembers buying, but their darkness was complete. The world beyond firelight simply stopped being visible. And invisible things are excellent at becoming frightening. A noise in the grass could be wind. It could be a small animal. It could be a snake. It could be a predator. It could be another person. You would not know immediately, and not knowing is one of the oldest human discomforts. We like explanations. Even bad explanations often feel better than none. If something happens repeatedly and you cannot control it, you begin looking for patterns. If the animals arrive after a certain moon, you remember the moon. If rain comes after a particular change in the wind, you remember the wind. If someone performs a ritual and then the rain comes, the two events become difficult to separate. Not because ancient people were foolish, because human brains are extraordinarily good at connecting things, sometimes too good. We still do it. We have simply upgraded the vocabulary. The people who built Göbekli Tepe lived in a world where almost everything important was uncertain. Rainfall, animal migration, illness, pregnancy, injury, weather, food, other groups, death. A person could be healthy in the morning and dangerously ill by night without understanding why. A wound that appeared minor could become fatal. A child could develop a fever. An animal migration could arrive late. A season could be strange. The ground itself could move. And there was no institution waiting nearby to explain that any of this was statistically normal. The uncomfortable thing about uncertainty is that doing nothing feels unbearable. So humans create actions. We repeat them. We formalize them. We teach them. At first, perhaps the action is practical. Someone says, "Put the food here." Everyone remembers. Next year, the food goes there again. Eventually, it becomes the place where food is always placed. Then perhaps only certain people are allowed to place it. Then perhaps there is a correct order, a correct time, a correct gesture. A reason is attached. A story appears. And within a few generations, nobody remembers the afternoon when someone merely put the food there because it was closer to the wall. This is how necessity can become tradition. And once a tradition is old enough, reversing it can feel dangerous. Not logically dangerous, emotionally dangerous. You know the feeling in a much smaller form. There are things families do because they have always done them. Nobody knows why. Change the arrangement, and somebody becomes uncomfortable. Use the wrong dish. Sit in the wrong place. Skip the familiar gesture. Nothing terrible happens, but something feels wrong. Now imagine that feeling in a world where there is no written distinction between custom, survival, religion, memory, and law. Maybe those categories did not feel separate at all. Perhaps a hunting ritual was practical and sacred. Perhaps preparing food was ordinary and ceremonial. Perhaps building an enclosure was construction and worship and politics and family obligation all at once. We like tidy categories because tidy categories fit in books. Human life rarely cooperates, and the closer we look at Göbekli Tepe, the less tidy it becomes. Take the animals carved into the stone. There are foxes, snakes, wild boar, birds, aurochs, gazelles, creatures that would have been familiar, but familiar does not mean harmless. A wild boar is familiar until it is angry. An aurochs is familiar from a respectful distance. A snake is very familiar if you notice it before touching it. This is not a decorative garden of gentle animals. Much of the imagery comes from a world where animals were not scenery. They were food, danger, competition, movement, warning, season, and sometimes death. Imagine seeing a large wild animal, not through a windshield or behind a fence, but as another creature sharing the same physical world with you. No ranger, no emergency number, no tranquilizer, no metal weapon. You have stone points, knowledge, other people, and a healthy interest in not being trampled. A successful hunt could feed many people. An unsuccessful one might injure someone. And an injured hunter creates another problem. Now somebody must help them move. Somebody must bring food. Somebody must do their work. A broken leg does not merely hurt the individual, it changes the workload of the group. This is something modern history often misses. Survival was not simply finding enough calories, it was managing inconvenience. Constant, irritating, dangerous inconvenience. Your shoes hurt. Except there are no modern shoes. Your water is far away. Your food spoils. Your child is crying. Your fire is smoking. An animal has damaged something. Your cutting edge has broken. It is raining. Now it is raining too much. Someone is injured. Someone is angry. Someone else has eaten more than they should. A relative from another group has arrived unexpectedly. And apparently, we are moving an 8-ton pillar tomorrow. Wonderful. This is the world behind the monument. Not silent, solemn people walking majestically through a sacred landscape. People, tired people, hungry people, funny people, jealous people, people who probably told stories while they worked, people who misunderstood each other, people who remembered insults, people who flirted, people who disliked someone for reasons that would sound embarrassingly petty 11,000 years later. And yet somehow these imperfect people cooperated enough to build something extraordinary. That cooperation is one of Göbekli Tepe's deepest mysteries. Not the carving, not the age, the cooperation. Because large projects create social problems before they solve anything. If 50 people work together, somebody has to decide what happens first. If food is distributed, someone decides how. If people travel from different communities, they arrive with different relationships, different debts, different expectations, different stories, perhaps different ways of speaking. And gatherings that unite people also create opportunities for conflict. The person you have avoided for 6 months is suddenly sitting near your fire. Someone from another group claims an animal you helped kill. A marriage arrangement is discussed. A promise is made. A promise is broken. Someone drinks too much if fermented beverages were present. Someone insults someone else's brother. There are certain parts of civilization that require surprisingly little infrastructure, and yet large gatherings also solve problems. They allow news to move, partners to meet, alliances to form, knowledge to spread, tools to be exchanged, stories to be repeated. Perhaps rituals help strangers become less strange. If everyone performs the same sequence, everyone knows what comes next. Stand here. Bring this. Wait. Eat now. Enter now. Leave now. Repeat. Ritual is predictable. And predictability is comforting, especially when almost everything outside the ritual is not. The animals may not come. The rain may fail. Someone may become sick. But this gesture is always performed the same way. This song is always sung at this moment. This object is always placed here. This pillar has always stood in this position. And once a place becomes associated with predictability, People may return to it precisely because the rest of life is unpredictable. Year after year, generation after generation, the place becomes older than any person alive. That matters. Imagine being born into a world where the great stones were already there. Your parents knew them. Their parents knew them. No one you personally remember saw the first one raised. Perhaps the stories say who built them. Perhaps the stories disagree. Perhaps every group has a slightly different version. And somewhere along the way, the stones stop being things people made. Psychologically, they become things that have always existed. We do this even with relatively young buildings. A house that has been in a family for 4 generations feels ancient to the 5th. Nobody thinks about the afternoon somebody first selected the door hinges. It simply belongs to the world. Now stretch that across centuries. The original builders disappear. Their children maintain the structures. Later generations alter them. Walls are repaired. Pillars are moved. Spaces change. Something built for one purpose may take on another. And this is where tradition becomes strange. Because the longer a tradition survives, the easier it becomes to preserve the action while losing the original explanation. You still do it. You just no longer know exactly why. And eventually, someone asks, why? The answer becomes simple. Because this is how it is done. There is a surprisingly short distance between that sentence and civilization. Göbekli Tepe existed during a period when human life in this region was changing. People who had long depended heavily on hunting and gathering were moving through a world where cultivation, settlement, storage, and eventually farming were becoming increasingly important. But nobody woke up one morning and announced the Neolithic Revolution. Historical revolutions are usually much neater after historians name them. For the people living through them, change probably arrived as a series of annoying practical decisions. Stay here a little longer, store some grain, clear this area, collect these seeds, return next season, build a stronger structure, protect the food, dig here, do it again. And then one day, perhaps many generations later, moving away becomes difficult. You have storage, structures, memory attached to place, dead people associated with place, relationships tied to place, fields, or useful stands of plants near place. A temporary solution has become a permanent life. This is one of humanity's favorite mistakes. We solve a problem. Then the solution creates a new problem. Then we build another solution around the first one. Eventually, nobody is allowed to move the original solution because society has developed several administrative procedures regarding it. Göbekli Tepe comes from a world where versions of this process may have been beginning. People gathering more often, staying longer, managing more resources, coordinating larger projects. And every additional layer of coordination creates a little more dependence. Someone knows the ritual. Someone controls the food. Someone understands the stonework. Someone remembers the route to water. Someone knows when the gazelles usually move. Special knowledge appears, and special knowledge changes relationships. The person who knows something others need becomes important, at first only temporarily. Perhaps just for this hunt, just for this building, just for this ceremony. But if the need repeats, the role repeats. And if the role repeats long enough, the person is replaced by another person doing the same role. Now you no longer have merely a helpful individual. You have something close to an institution, not a government, not a priesthood we can prove. Nothing that neat. Just a repeated human arrangement that begins to survive the people inside it. Temporary things becoming permanent. Again, the same pattern. And perhaps the stones were part of that pattern too. Because stone is an unusual material for people accustomed to movement. Wood decays, skin rots, fibre disappears. A temporary shelter can be left behind, but stone insists. It remains after the person who shaped it is dead. It remembers without understanding. Perhaps that was part of its power. Perhaps that was also part of the problem, because eventually something changed. Buildings at Göbekli Tepe were altered, repaired, filled, abandoned. Some suffered damage. Sediment entered spaces. Walls were added. The landscape itself shifted. And at some point, the great enclosures stopped being used in the way they once had been. Which brings us back to the hill. Because if a place has existed longer than anyone can remember, abandoning it is not simply practical. It can be emotionally dangerous. What happens if you stop maintaining the place where your grandparents gathered? What happens if the animals carved there are no longer honoured? What happens if the great faceless figures are left exposed? What happens if you walk away? Nothing, perhaps. Or perhaps everything. That is the trouble with uncertainty. You do not know until after you have done it. And if something bad happens afterward, human beings are extremely good at connecting the two. A child becomes sick after the ceremony is changed. The rain fails after a ritual is skipped. Someone dies after a structure is damaged. Coincidence is a modern word. Meaning is much older. So perhaps when parts of Göbekli Tepe stopped functioning, leaving them open did not feel acceptable. Perhaps closure required action. Perhaps the place had to be covered. Perhaps what looks to us like destruction was, to them, completion. Or perhaps we have misunderstood the entire burial. Because there is another possibility. One that makes the story stranger, not simpler. The people may not have begun burying Göbekli Tepe at all. The hill may have started doing it for them. And if that happened, then the question is no longer simply why someone buried a sacred place. The question becomes what people do when the landscape itself begins closing a place they believed should remain open, and whether, at some point, they decided to help it. The first sign that something is wrong is often very small. A little water where there should not be water. A crack that was not there last season. A wall leaning slightly more than anyone remembers. A patch of earth that stays damp longer than it used to. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worthy of panic. Just an inconvenience. And inconveniences are dangerous because people learn to live with them. At first, someone clears the mud. Then someone places a few stones along the edge. Then the stones become a low barrier. Later, the barrier becomes a wall. The wall is repaired, then enlarged, then rebuilt, and eventually, generations later, people look at the wall and assume it was always supposed to be there. The temporary solution becomes part of the place. This is one of the quiet ways human beings create permanence. Not by making a grand decision, usually by being mildly annoyed several years in a row. At Göbekli Tepe, the landscape itself may have been creating exactly this kind of problem. The great enclosures were not sitting on some perfectly flat, obedient piece of land. The mound changed over time. People built on it. They dumped material. They constructed new spaces. Buildings appeared above older ones. Surfaces changed. The slope changed. And water, unlike humans, has very little respect for sacred architecture. it goes downhill every time. It does not care how important the pillar is. It does not care how many generations have gathered around it. It does not care whether someone spent years carving a fox into the limestone. If there is a lower place, water will attempt to visit it. And southeastern Anatolia is not simply dry. That is another modern misunderstanding. We imagine ancient dry landscapes as permanently dusty, but dry regions can receive violent, seasonal rain. The long dry months can make the rain feel even more dramatic when it arrives. The ground hardens, dust gathers, then weather changes. Clouds form, the temperature drops, wind arrives, and suddenly water begins moving across a landscape that has spent months waiting for it. At first, perhaps, the rain is welcome. People need water. Animals need water. Plants need water. A dry season ending is good news for a little while. Then rain continues. The ground softens. Channels begin carrying runoff. Loose sediment starts moving. Small stones move, then larger ones. Material from higher parts of the settlement begins creeping downhill. Water finds cracks. It enters walls. It carries debris into spaces people would prefer to keep clean. And the same rain that means survival becomes a maintenance problem. Again, the ancient world refuses to organize itself into our categories. Good weather can become dangerous weather. Sacred space can become engineering space. A ritual enclosure can suddenly require someone with a shovel, or whatever counted as a shovel at the time. Imagine a night of heavy rain. You wake because the sound is different. Rain on skin or thatch. Water running somewhere nearby. People moving. Someone speaking too loudly. Perhaps a child is frightened. Perhaps nobody is frightened yet, because this has happened before. You sit up. The air is cold in a way the afternoon was not. There is mud underfoot. You can smell wet earth. And wet earth has a very particular smell when it arrives after a long dry period. It feels clean at first, fresh. Then you notice where the water is going, toward the lower enclosure. Someone is already there. Another person joins them. The entrance is taking water, so people begin moving debris. There is no philosophical discussion, no ritual council. No one asks whether this moment will appear in a documentary 11,000 years later. They simply try to stop the water. That is how most history feels while it is happening. Practical, annoying, cold. Someone brings stones. Someone builds up an edge. Someone directs water away. Another person says the water should be directed somewhere else. They disagree. A section of wall is reinforced. Problem solved for tonight. And temporary solutions are very persuasive when they work. The next rain comes. The same place receives water. Now the small wall is already there. So people add to it. It becomes higher, more stable, more intentional. Years pass. Perhaps children who watched adults repair it become adults themselves. Now they do not remember the wall as a repair. The wall is simply part of the enclosure. Its purpose may still be practical. But practical things become symbolic very easily when they survive long enough. A boundary is a good example. At first, stones are placed to keep mud away. Then stones mark an edge. Then the edge marks a space. Then the space becomes different from everything outside it. People behave differently after crossing it. Perhaps not because anyone planned that. Perhaps because boundaries change behavior. Stand on one side of a doorway and you are outside. Take one step, and you are inside. Nothing about your body has changed. The air has barely changed. But suddenly, expectations change. Lower your voice. Wait, do not touch that. Stand here. The human mind loves thresholds. We assign meaning to the act of crossing. And eventually, even if the original boundary was built because everyone was tired of cleaning up after the rain, entering the space may feel like entering something separate. This is why architecture becomes dangerous to historians. Buildings preserve solutions, but they do not preserve the conversation that created them. We find a wall. We do not find the argument. We find an entrance. We do not find the person who complained that the previous entrance let in too much water. We find a pillar moved from one position to another. We do not find the day everyone discovered it was leaning. So we look at the final shape and imagine design. But much of human design is accumulated irritation. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not working in a frozen architectural plan. The structures changed. Walls were altered. Pillars were reused. Spaces were reshaped. Repairs happened. This matters because a living sacred place is rarely pristine. It is patched, adapted, corrected. Someone realizes an earlier decision was bad. Someone makes a better one, or at least a different one. And the place begins accumulating the decisions of people who never met each other. One generation repairs the work of another. That repair becomes the starting point for the next. Eventually, nobody is building the original structure anymore. They are building their understanding of an inherited structure. And inheritance creates a strange kind of obedience. If your grandparents used a space in a particular way, changing it can feel more serious than changing something new. You may not know why the stones stand where they do, but moving them feels wrong. You may not understand why one pillar is decorated differently, but you know it matters. Meaning can survive even when explanation fades. Perhaps especially then, because something mysterious is often harder to change than something understood. If someone tells you exactly why a wall exists, you can decide whether the reason still applies. If no one knows why the wall exists, removing it feels like a risk. What if there was a reason? That question can preserve traditions for centuries. It can preserve very bad furniture arrangements for decades. It can certainly preserve a stone enclosure. But eventually, nature does not ask permission. Walls lean, roof supports weaken, earth moves. And Göbekli Tepe stood in a region where the ground itself was capable of movement. Earthquakes are difficult for modern people, even with seismology. We understand faults. We understand tectonic plates. We understand aftershocks. We have emergency systems. We have building standards. And still, when the floor begins moving beneath us, something very old in the body responds before scientific knowledge becomes useful. The ground is not supposed to move. That is almost the definition of ground. Everything else may move. People move. Animals move. Clouds move. Water moves. But ground is the thing you stand on while other things move. When that rule breaks, the mind notices. Now remove the explanation. No tectonic plates. No seismic maps. No news reports announcing a magnitude. No distant expert explaining that the earthquake originated somewhere below the crust. Only movement. Perhaps it begins with sound, a low vibration. Animals react. Someone notices hanging objects moving if anything is suspended. Dust falls from a wall. Then the world shifts. Stone scrapes against stone. A heavy object falls. People run. Some freeze. Someone calls for a child. Someone is hurt. And then it stops. Silence after a violent sound can feel almost louder than the sound itself. People listen. They wait. The ground seems stable again. But trust has changed. That is the part that matters. Once the earth has moved, it can move again. Of course, statistically, it always could. But now, everyone knows. And knowledge of danger changes a place. A wall that looked old yesterday now looks unstable. A crack that seemed harmless is examined. A pillar that has always leaned slightly becomes suspicious. The structure has not changed much. The people looking at it have. Fear is often a change in interpretation. The same dark doorway is harmless until you hear something behind it. The same hillside is ordinary until a landslide. The same sacred enclosure is eternal until one stone falls. And then, people must decide what to do with a sacred place that has demonstrated its mortality. This is not a minor problem. We are comfortable with ruins because we live among things designed to be replaceable. Buildings are demolished, roads rerouted, a store closes, another opens, a church can be restored, a house can be insured. But imagine a structure that is older than every living memory, a place whose authority may come partly from the fact that it has always been there. Then it cracks. What exactly has failed? Engineering? Tradition? Protection? The people? The beings represented by the pillars? The agreement between community and place? We do not know how the builders interpreted damage. We should resist pretending that we do, but we can understand the human discomfort. When something culturally permanent becomes physically unstable, people rarely respond with complete emotional neutrality. You can see versions of this even now. An old family house is damaged. Someone says, "It is only a building." Another person cries when a wall is removed. A monument is moved, people argue. A tree planted by a grandparent dies. Nobody believes the tree is literally the grandparent, and yet cutting it down can feel like losing something again. Places absorb people, not literally. Memory does the absorbing. So an enclosure at Göbekli Tepe may have carried generations of memory. Who stood there, who died, who gathered, who hunted, who was initiated, perhaps. Who was excluded, perhaps. What was promised, what was feared, what was remembered incorrectly. All the invisible material that architecture holds without showing any of it. Then add damage. Now imagine that after an earthquake or a period of slope instability, people make repairs. They do not abandon the place immediately. That is important. Repair is evidence of attachment. You repair what you still need. You stabilize what you still value. If sediment enters, you clear it. If a wall is damaged, you rebuild. If a pillar shifts, you support it. Perhaps you add a retaining wall uphill. Perhaps you change drainage. Perhaps the solution works for 10 years, maybe 20, perhaps much longer. And then another problem appears. This is how landscapes defeat human confidence. Not in one dramatic event, slowly. A little pressure here, a little water there, another repair, another wall, more debris, more maintenance. The sacred place becomes increasingly difficult to keep sacred, because it is becoming increasingly difficult merely to keep dry. There is a quiet humor in this. Human beings may gather to address the universe, death, animals, ancestors, powers beyond themselves, and then spend the morning unclogging drainage. The spiritual and the mundane have always shared a wall. Someone is contemplating existence. Someone else is asking who moved the basket. Probably both are important. If the enclosure was used for ritual gatherings, every problem with the building becomes a problem with timing. People may have arrived expecting to use it. Now repairs are unfinished. A wall is unsafe. Sediment has covered part of the floor. Do you delay the gathering? Move it? Use another enclosure? Perform the ritual differently? And once you change a ritual because of a practical problem, the changed ritual may become the new normal. There it is again. Improvisation becomes tradition. Perhaps a doorway closes because the wall is unstable. People use another entrance. Years later, that entrance becomes the correct entrance. Perhaps a pillar is moved during repair. Later generations tell a story explaining its new position. Perhaps part of the building becomes inaccessible. Only certain people enter. Restriction begins as safety. Restriction becomes custom. Custom becomes sacred rule. We cannot prove these exact sequences, but they are the kind of human mechanisms that make ancient sites more understandable, not less mysterious, more, because the strange parts do not require strange people. They require ordinary people trapped inside long periods of time. And long periods of time are extremely good at making ordinary decisions look mysterious. Now imagine a point when clearing the sediment no longer feels worth it. This may happen very slowly. At first, everyone agrees to clear it. Then fewer people show up. Another enclosure is easier to use. A newer building exists nearby. The older space is still important, just less convenient. This is how abandonment often begins, not with rejection, with preference. People choose the easier path one time, then again. The old path grows weeds. The old doorway collects dirt. Someone says they will repair it later. Later becomes next season. Next season becomes next year. A child grows up having rarely entered the older enclosure. For their parents, the place is familiar. For them, it is already old. For their children, perhaps almost legendary. And the emotional relationship to the building changes. A place can move from active to ancestral without anybody formally declaring it dead. That word may matter, dead, because buildings can behave like bodies in human imagination. They have a beginning, a period of use. They age, they are repaired, they accumulate scars. Eventually, they cease functioning. Then societies must decide what to do with them. Some buildings are stripped for material. Some are left to collapse. Some are burned. Some are sealed. Some are rebuilt on top of. Some are deliberately covered. The act of ending a building can be as meaningful as building it. And this is where the old interpretation of Göbekli Tepe became so compelling. Archaeologists encountered fills inside some enclosures containing rubble, stone fragments, animal bone, flint, and other material. It looked, in places, as though people had intentionally put material into the structures, not simply one thin layer of natural soil accumulating over centuries, but large quantities of fill, enough to create the idea of deliberate burial. And once you see that image, it is difficult to forget. People standing around a structure they had inherited from previous generations, carrying baskets, carrying rubble, throwing material inside. The floor slowly disappears. Lower wall courses disappear. Carved animals vanish. The lower part of a pillar is covered. Then more, until a space designed to hold people begins holding earth instead. There is something psychologically reversed about it. A building creates emptiness. That is what architecture does. You take material and arrange it around an empty volume. The empty part is the useful part. The room, the courtyard, the enclosure. Then burial removes the emptiness. You fill the space until the architecture can no longer function. It becomes solid again, almost as if returning the building to the hill it came from. Stone extracted from bedrock. Stone shaped. Stone raised. Space created. Space used. Then space filled. The structure disappears back into landscape. If this was intentional, it would be difficult to imagine it as casual housekeeping. It would require labor. People would need to move material, a lot of it. And moving material is exhausting. This is another reason the question matters. People do not usually perform enormous unnecessary tasks for no reason. They may perform enormous unnecessary tasks for reasons we no longer understand. That is different. Something made the effort worthwhile. Perhaps closure, perhaps protection, perhaps disposal. Perhaps the building had become unsafe. Perhaps filling stabilized it. Perhaps material from nearby construction simply needed somewhere to go. Humans have always enjoyed solving two problems with one pile of rubble. Or perhaps the act itself carried meaning. The difficulty is that all these possibilities can coexist. Practical and symbolic are not opposites. A burial can protect and honor. A wall can stabilize and divide. A feast can feed and create alliances. A hunt can provide calories and status. A structure can be closed because it is unsafe and because people believe its life is complete. We keep wanting one reason because one reason makes a cleaner story. Ancient people probably had several. Modern people usually do. Ask someone why they kept an old house. Money, memory, family, convenience, fear of change, habit. No single answer is false. Göbekli Tepe may be similar, and then newer research complicated the burial story. Because when archaeologists looked more carefully at how sediment could move across the mound, the possibility of natural processes became harder to ignore. Rainwater, slope movement, collapsed architecture, debris flowing downhill, materials entering enclosures over time. The hill was not a passive container waiting for humans to fill it. The hill participated. This is the idea I want you to keep in mind. The hill participated because human beings like to imagine themselves as the authors of ancient monuments. We build, we alter, we destroy, we abandon, but landscapes also build and destroy. Rain dismantles, wind covers, roots push, earthquakes move. Gravity performs very patient demolition, and Göbekli Tepe existed long enough for all of them to become collaborators. Perhaps what archaeologists first understood as a deliberate filling event was, in some places, the result of a much more complicated conversation between people and landscape. A heavy rain carries sediment inside. People remove some. Another event brings more. A wall fails. Debris collapses. People repair part of it. Some material is deliberately added. Later more arrives naturally. Eventually, the space is no longer cleared. Then people add something else. A broken sculpture, a stone head, animal bones, discarded material, something carefully placed, something casually thrown. Century after century, the distinction between intentional and accidental becomes difficult to read. And this is exactly how human places usually become archaeological sites, not as one clean moment, as layers of decisions, some deliberate, some lazy, some sacred, some practical, some nobody intended at all. And by the time archaeologists arrive thousands of years later, all of those decisions are sitting together in the same dirt. One layer says someone cared deeply, the next says someone needed somewhere to dump broken stone. The next may be rain, the next may be collapse, the next contains a human bone, and our minds desperately want them to belong to one story. Perhaps they do not. Perhaps that is the unsettling part. Not that Göbekli Tepe hides one enormous secret, but that it contains thousands of small human decisions whose meanings have been compressed together until they look like one mystery. Imagine returning to an enclosure after years of neglect. You remember it from childhood, or perhaps your parents talked about it. The entrance is partly blocked. Plants grow where people once stood. Sediment has risen against the wall. One carved animal is barely visible above the fill. The central pillars remain, still enormous, still faceless, but now lower portions are hidden. The room feels smaller because the floor has risen. Sound behaves differently. You step inside. Perhaps someone tells you this place should not be used anymore. Why? Because it is old. Because it is damaged. Because something happened here. Because another place is used now. Because this one belongs to the ancestors. Because it is dangerous. Because it is closed. Notice how quickly practical and supernatural language can merge. A dangerous place becomes forbidden. A forbidden place accumulates stories. Stories explain the prohibition. Then the stories become more memorable than the original danger. Children are told not to go inside. Nobody tells a 6-year-old about retaining wall failure. They say something simpler. Do not go there. Why? Because you should not. Why? Because something is there. Perhaps. We do this now. Abandoned buildings gather legends. Old wells gather warnings. Caves gather stories. A completely practical prohibition develops a supernatural personality in one generation. Do not enter because the roof may collapse becomes do not enter because the place is bad. And once people believe a place is bad, nobody repairs the roof. Then the roof collapses, and everybody feels confirmed. Human reasoning can be wonderfully circular. The question in our title asks what they were hiding from. It assumes fear. That is useful, because fear is compelling. But maybe the word hiding is wrong. Maybe they were not hiding from anything. Maybe they were saying goodbye. Those two actions can look identical in the ground. You fill a room, you cover a carving, you close an entrance. If you are afraid of what is inside, you might do that. If you love what is inside, you might do that too. We bury enemies. We bury family. The physical act does not tell us the emotion. This is where archaeology becomes frustrating. Bones do not preserve tone of voice. Walls do not preserve reluctance. Sediment does not tell you whether the person carrying it was crying, bored, frightened, or simply tired. And yet, we can still ask what closure might have felt like. Imagine being told that an enclosure used by your parents will no longer be opened. Perhaps you helped maintain it. Perhaps you remember feasts there. Perhaps a relative was associated with a ritual there. Perhaps the building contains images you have known since childhood. Now people begin filling it. You carry rubble. A person beside you carries animal bone mixed with earth. Someone else brings broken stone. The material falls. Dust rises. The first layers cover the floor. The room begins changing quickly. That is the strange part about filling a space. Centuries of use can be erased vertically in days or weeks. The place where people stood disappears under your feet. A carved detail reaches ground level, then vanishes. Something that was visible for generations becomes inaccessible, and if you are the last generation to see it, you know something future people do not. You know what is underneath. That knowledge may matter for a while, then you die. The next generation knows only the story. Then the next generation knows a shorter story. Eventually, perhaps people know only that there is an old place beneath the mound. Or maybe they forget entirely. Memory is less durable than stone. This is another irony. Humans may have covered the stones to preserve meaning, but the covering may have helped preserve the objects after the meaning disappeared. The burial that erased access also protected the carvings. The act of forgetting helped archaeology. History is full of this unpleasant cooperation. Destruction preserves. Fire bakes clay tablets. Collapse seals rooms. Volcanic ash buries towns. Mud protects wood. Burial hides architecture from the people who might otherwise dismantle it. The thing that ends a place sometimes saves it. And if parts of Göbekli Tepe were intentionally filled, those people may have unknowingly created the conditions that allowed us to see their work 11,000 years later. Not their reasons, just their work. The reason remains where voices used to be, gone, which means we are forced back into the building itself. The faceless figures, the animals, the human bones, the altered skulls. Because if the architecture cannot explain why it was closed, perhaps the things placed inside it can. And this is where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Until now, we have been talking mostly about stone and water. Things that do not feel pain. Things that do not remember. But among the debris and fills of Göbekli Tepe were pieces of human beings. Not symbolic humans. Not carved humans. Actual bone. And some of those bones had been treated in ways that suggest the people of this place had a relationship with the dead that would feel very strange to most of us now. Not because they were monsters. Probably because death had never left their world in the first place. Death is easier to understand when it is far away. A name on a stone, a date, a photograph, a story told by someone older. Distance gives death manners. It becomes quiet, contained. Something that happened, but in a world without modern hospitals, without funeral homes, without sealed coffins, without refrigeration, without professionals arriving to remove the body, death would have been much more physical. It would have stayed in the room, stayed near the fire, stayed close to the family. Someone had to touch the body. Someone had to wash it, perhaps, move it, wrap it, carry it, decide what happened next. And whatever beliefs surrounded death, there was also the body itself, heavy, changing, beginning to smell, refusing to participate in the symbolic elegance people sometimes prefer when discussing the past. This matters at Göbekli Tepe, because human remains were found there. Not complete graves, neatly placed beneath a floor, with an inscription explaining who belonged to whom. Fragments, pieces, bones mixed into deposits, and among them, skull fragments that had been deliberately modified, cut marks, grooves, evidence that at least some human skulls were handled after death in ways that were not simply accidental. That is uncomfortable, not because we should immediately imagine violence. That would be too easy, and probably too modern. The more interesting possibility is that the dead were still part of social life, not metaphorically, physically. A person dies, but their skull remains. Their identity may remain attached to it. Their family may remain attached to it. Their group may remain attached to it. And suddenly, death is no longer a clean boundary. The body stops living, but the person may not stop mattering. That distinction is much older than Göbekli Tepe. Human beings have been negotiating with their dead for an extremely long time. We visit graves. We keep ashes. We preserve photographs. We leave objects. We speak to people who are gone. We maintain rooms. We keep clothing. We inherit names. We repeat recipes. We argue about what the dead would have wanted. The dead are remarkably active for people who are no longer present. We simply keep their activity symbolic. At Göbekli Tepe, some of that relationship may have been more literal. Imagine losing someone in a small community. Not a stranger, not one person among millions. Someone whose absence changes the daily balance. The person who knew the hunting route. The person who repaired tools. The person who remembered the songs. The person who knew which plants made you sick. The person who mediated arguments. The person who was difficult. The person everyone secretly found exhausting. Death does not improve everyone's personality immediately. But absence changes practical life. Who does their work? Who inherits their obligations? Who cares for their children? Who receives their tools? Who speaks for their household? Who remembers the promises they made? We often talk about prehistoric death as ritual, but before ritual comes inconvenience. A brutal word, but an honest one. Someone is gone, and everything they used to do must now be redistributed. And because small groups depend heavily on individuals, a death can be socially destabilizing. That may be part of why the dead become powerful. Not supernatural power, necessarily. Social power. Memory. A dead person cannot change their story anymore. The living do that for them. One relative remembers generosity. Another remembers cruelty. One group says the dead person was wise. Another remembers several very bad decisions. Over time, a complicated human being becomes a simpler figure. Ancestor, founder, hunter, mother, enemy, protector, danger, symbol. The dead gradually become easier to use. They cannot object. And this is where skulls become interesting. The human skull is unlike most bones. A rib is clearly part of a body. A femur is part of a body. A skull feels more like the person because the face was there, the eyes, the mouth, expression, recognition. It is the part of the skeleton we instinctively identify as identity. Even a skull with no face left can feel like a face. That may be one reason skulls become important in many societies. They are bone, but they still suggest a person. At Göbekli Tepe, some skull fragments show modifications that researchers have taken seriously as evidence for a specific relationship with the head after death. Grooves may have helped with suspension or display. Cut marks may reflect processing. We cannot reconstruct the exact ceremony. That is important. We do not know whether skulls were displayed, hung, carried, decorated, stored, reburied, handled only briefly. We do not know whose skulls they were. Revered ancestors, enemies, special individuals, ordinary members of a group, victims, relatives. The evidence does not give us names, only actions. And actions without explanation are exactly where imagination becomes dangerous. It is tempting to say skull cult and let the phrase do all the work. Skull cult sounds dramatic. It sounds like torchlight and chanting and somebody making a documentary voice much lower than necessary. But the actual reality could have been quieter, more intimate, more normal. A grandmother dies. Months later, after the body has decomposed, part of the remains are recovered. The skull is cleaned, handled by someone who loved her, maybe displayed during gatherings, maybe remembered, maybe returned to the earth. From the outside, disturbing. From inside the culture, respectful, or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps the skull belonged to someone feared. Perhaps modification reduced their power. Perhaps the body had to be controlled. We cannot know. The same physical action can carry opposite meanings. Cutting a body can be violence. It can be medicine. It can be autopsy. It can be preparation for burial. It can be ritual. Context changes everything. And context is exactly what disappeared. This is why prehistoric archaeology is so cruel. It preserves the gesture, not the intention. A groove is still there. The thought behind the groove is gone. So we have to remain inside uncertainty. And uncertainty, again, is where this story lives. Imagine entering one of the stone enclosures, knowing that human remains were part of the symbolic world around you. The pillars stand above. Their bodies are enormous, arms carved along their sides, hands near their fronts, belts, clothing details, human enough to recognize, but no faces. Then somewhere within this culture, actual human heads may have been separated from bodies and treated differently from the rest of the skeleton. There is a strange reversal there. The huge stone bodies have no heads we can recognize. The human dead leave behind heads without bodies, body without face, face without body. The architecture and the dead seem to circle the same missing thing. Identity. Who is a person when the body changes? Who remains after death? Who do the pillars represent? Are they humans? Ancestors? Beings larger than humans? Groups? Ideas? We do not know, but someone did. That may be the hardest fact to sit with. For the people using Göbekli Tepe, these images were probably not mysterious. A fox meant something. A vulture meant something. A particular belt meant something. One pillar may have been distinct from another in ways obvious to everyone present. Like seeing a national flag today. You do not need an archaeologist to explain that cloth. You recognize it immediately. Now imagine all the people who could explain Göbekli Tepe dying, one by one, not in catastrophe. Just time. A storyteller dies. Another remembers most of the story. Their child remembers a shortened version. Another generation changes the names. A marriage brings another tradition. A settlement moves. A ritual shifts. The enclosure remains. But the explanation begins thinning. This could happen slowly enough that nobody notices, which is how cultures forget most things. There is no ceremony of forgetting. One day, fewer people know, then fewer, then nobody. The object remains after the knowledge. And the stranger the object becomes, the more authority it can acquire. If no one remembers exactly who a pillar represents, perhaps that does not make it less important. It may make it more important. Because uncertainty encourages caution. Do not touch it. Why? Because that is not done. Do not move it. Why? Because it has always been there. Do not enter that space. Why? Because only certain people do. Do not disturb the remains. Why? Because they belong here. Rules can survive reasons. They are very good at that. And once reasons disappear, rules become strangely resistant to change. A person can argue against a reason. It is harder to argue with tradition. Tradition does not have to defend itself. It simply says, "This is how it is." That may have been particularly powerful in a world with no written law. Custom is memory made enforceable, and memory is not always accurate. Imagine two groups gathering at Göbekli Tepe. Both claim the same ancestor. Or perhaps they claim different ancestors represented by different symbols. A carved animal might serve as identity. A pillar might belong to a story of origins. A feast might renew a relationship. A skull might prove lineage. Again, we cannot demonstrate these exact arrangements, but we can understand the kinds of tensions that would arise if memory, ancestry, and place were connected. Because ancestry is never only about the past. It tells people who has rights in the present. Who belongs here? Who may enter? Who may speak? Who receives food first? Who may marry whom? Who owns a story? Who owns a place? The dead can be very useful in such arguments. My grandfather stood here. This was our enclosure. Our ancestor is represented there. Our people built that wall. Nobody can interview the grandfather. Convenient. And this is how memory becomes politics. Even before formal states, even before written property, human beings are perfectly capable of attaching authority to the past without paperwork. We do it constantly, the old way. The founder's intention, the ancestral land, the family, tradition, the original agreement, the first people, the older claim. Age becomes legitimacy, and Göbekli Tepe itself was becoming old. That may have made it powerful, but old places create problems because every generation inherits both meaning and maintenance. You inherit the ritual. You also inherit the cracked wall. You inherit the sacred pillar. You also inherit the drainage problem. You inherit the ancestor. You also inherit whatever argument the ancestor started. The dead do not only leave wisdom, sometimes they leave obligations. Perhaps this is another reason humans create rituals around them. Ritual contains the dead. It gives grief a schedule. Now we do this, then this, then this. Now the body goes here. Now the object goes there. Now the name is spoken. Now the name is not spoken. Rules give shape to something emotionally shapeless. And when the ritual ends, the living know what happens next. Without it, grief can remain open. A building can function the same way. If an enclosure is no longer used, perhaps it needs an ending, not simply neglect. Closure, an action everyone recognizes. A final sequence. And if human remains were part of the symbolic language of Göbekli Tepe, then the closure of a building and the handling of a body may not have felt entirely unrelated. Both involve a thing that once contained life. A body stops living. An enclosure stops being used. Both remain physically present. Both can be dangerous to leave unresolved. Not physically dangerous necessarily, socially, emotionally, spiritually, perhaps. This is where we have to be careful. We cannot say the people of Göbekli Tepe believed buildings had souls. We cannot say they feared ghosts. We cannot say they performed funerals for architecture. But we can notice that human societies repeatedly treat important objects and places as if they have biographies. We speak of a ship being launched and retired. A building is born, dedicated, closed, demolished. A city dies. A tradition survives. A nation is young. A language is dead. We use biological language because human minds understand continuity through life. Perhaps ancient people did too. And if an enclosure had reached the end of its useful life, filling it might have been less like dumping dirt into a room and more like placing earth over a grave. The act looks similar. The emotion could be very different. Now, imagine the practical work. If people intentionally deposited material, somebody carried it, basket after basket. Stone fragments, earth, animal bone, broken objects, waste from meals, perhaps material from nearby buildings. It would not all be ceremonially pure. That is another modern expectation. We imagine sacred deposit as carefully selected objects arranged beautifully. But sacred and dirty often live together. A feast produces trash. Ritual produces leftovers. Bodies produce decay. Sacred spaces need cleaning. Religious festivals today produce mountains of plastic bottles. Humanity has never been especially good at separating transcendence from rubbish. So a fill containing ordinary debris does not automatically mean the act was meaningless. A burial pit can contain soil. A sacred fire can leave ash. A feast can leave broken bone. Meaning does not sterilize matter. If anything, repeated meaningful gatherings create more mess. Now consider the bones of animals: gazelle, wild boar, aurochs, other species, the remains of consumption, the evidence of food, and perhaps feast. Eating together is one of humanity's oldest social technologies. It solves several problems at once. People need calories. Food can be shared. Generosity can be displayed. Relationships can be renewed. Debts can be created. Status can be shown. News can travel. Marriage partners can meet. People can become mildly intoxicated if fermented drink is present and say things they regret. An impressively durable tradition. Feasting is warm from the inside. From the outside, it is logistics. How many people? How much meat? When are the animals hunted? Who prepares them? Who gets which cuts? Who grinds grain? Where is water stored? Where do people sleep? Where does waste go? What happens when the gathering is larger than expected? The more successful the event, the worse these problems become. Success creates pressure. More people want to come. More food is required. More labor, more organization. A gathering that began informally can become scheduled, then expected, then obligatory. The temporary event becomes an institution. There it is again. The pattern will not leave us alone. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe grew partly through this mechanism. One gathering, then another. People return. A structure is built. Another is built. Certain forms become familiar. Certain symbols repeat. People travel farther because they have heard about the place. The gathering becomes important, partly because people believe other people consider it important. That is how importance often works. A restaurant becomes difficult to book because it is difficult to book. A pilgrimage grows because people pilgrimage there. A social place accumulates gravity, and eventually the gathering itself begins determining the calendar. You need food ready before people arrive. You need materials. You need repairs finished. You need enough water. You need hunters coordinated. Perhaps gazelle migration helps determine timing. Perhaps seasonal rainfall does. Nature sets the schedule. People create ritual around it. Then, after enough generations, the ritual feels like the reason everyone gathers. Cause and explanation swap places. Humans are excellent at forgetting the practical origin of meaningful things. Perhaps a feast originally celebrated successful hunting. Later, the hunt becomes necessary because the feast must happen. What began as celebration becomes obligation, and obligations create anxiety. What if there is not enough food this year? What if the herds arrive late? What if rain has changed the landscape? What if another group takes the animals first? What if people travel and there is nothing to offer them? Generosity is easiest when supplies are abundant. When supplies are scarce, hospitality becomes politics. Who eats? Who waits? Who gets the marrow? Who receives the best meat? Who drinks first? Distribution reveals hierarchy, even when hierarchy is not formal. If everyone is supposedly equal, but one person always receives the best portion, people notice. If one family provides most of the food, they may gain influence. If one group controls water, that matters. If one person knows the ritual timing, that matters. Knowledge turns into leverage without anyone announcing it. And perhaps some of the roles around Göbekli Tepe became specialized, not specialists in the modern sense. No business cards, no office, no professional networking event among the T-pillars, but repeated skills: stone carving, hunting coordination, ritual knowledge, storytelling, food preparation, exchange, conflict mediation. The more often a gathering occurs, the more valuable experience becomes. The person who remembers what happened last year knows what to avoid. The person who remembers the old sequence corrects younger participants. You do that before this, not after. This object goes here. That animal is carved this way. The pillar stands there. And once someone becomes the keeper of correct procedure, they become difficult to replace. Authority can be born from knowing how things are supposed to be done. Then age and authority reinforce each other. I know, because I was here. Later, my father knew. Later, my family has always done this. The same structure that preserves knowledge can preserve power. And this may be where the dead become even more useful, because ancestors validate the present. If your authority comes from a living person, that person can lose an argument. If it comes from an ancestor, disagreement becomes disrespect. This is speculative, but the mechanism is human. And Göbekli Tepe gives us enough hints of ancestry: human remains, monumental figures, and communal architecture to keep the possibility open. Now imagine a younger generation. They inherit all of this: the structures, the rituals, the feast, the rules, the ancestor stories, the maintenance. But their world is changing. People are staying in settlements longer. Food strategies are changing. Cultivation becomes more important. New forms of architecture appear. Daily routines shift. Children grow up with habits their grandparents did not have, and old ceremonial obligations begin competing with new practical demands. This tension would not appear as a philosophical debate about cultural transformation. It would appear as scheduling. We need to tend this area. We need to repair that house. We cannot send as many people this year. The hunt was poor. We have stored grain. The gathering takes too long. The old enclosure needs another repair. Use the newer one. Small decisions. Always small decisions. The old structure becomes less central, not because anyone rejects the ancestors, because everyone is busy. Cultures often change because people are busy. The grand explanation comes later. At the time, someone just did not show up. Then, fewer people showed up. Then, the ritual changed to accommodate fewer people. Then someone said the new way was more correct. Humans are very efficient at giving necessity a respectable explanation after the fact. This is how a place can lose use without losing sacredness. In fact, reduced use can sometimes increase sacredness. When ordinary activity stops, mystery grows. A room no longer entered becomes special. An object no longer touched becomes precious. A language no longer understood sounds ancient. A ritual performed only once a year feels more important than one performed every morning. Scarcity increases meaning. Perhaps older enclosures at Göbekli Tepe became increasingly separate from daily life. We do not know, but if they did, their eventual closure could have felt less like destroying something active and more like sealing something already receding into memory. And then we arrive again at the skulls, because the dead recede the same way. At first, a dead person is immediate. Their clothing remains, their sleeping place, their voice is remembered precisely. Years pass. The voice becomes harder to reconstruct. A child who never knew them learns stories. Then stories simplify. Eventually, the person becomes ancestor rather than individual. The body is gone. The identity is condensed, perhaps into a name, a story, an object, a skull. And this is where memory becomes physical again. If a skull is kept, it resists abstraction. The dead person may be becoming legendary, but here is part of the actual body. Touch it, and mythology collides with biology. It is difficult to imagine anything more direct. Perhaps that is why such objects can be powerful. They make the past tangible. But tangible pasts create responsibility. What happens when you no longer want to keep the skull? Can you throw it away? Probably not. What happens when the person it belonged to is no longer remembered? Does the object become less sacred? Or more? Does anonymity make it dangerous? Does it become simply the ancestor? Again, we cannot know. But notice the repeated structural problem. A meaningful object persists longer than the explanation attached to it. Stone pillars, skulls, symbols, buildings. All of them outlive individual memory. And once that happens, societies must decide what to do with things they cannot comfortably discard, but no longer fully understand. There are not many options. Keep using them. Reinterpret them. Move them. Break them. Hide them. Bury them. This is where the question, what were they hiding from, changes shape. Perhaps they were not hiding from an external enemy. Perhaps they were dealing with inherited things that had become too heavy. Not physically heavy, though 8-ton pillars are certainly doing their part. Culturally heavy, objects that require maintenance. Rituals that require labor. Ancestors that require remembrance. Rules that require obedience. Places that require repair. The past can become expensive. Every generation inherits obligations from people who no longer have to perform them. At some point, a living society quietly renegotiates with its dead. We still honor you, but not in this way. We still remember. But we will not maintain this place forever. We will build differently, live differently, eat differently, gather elsewhere. And perhaps the burial of an old structure is not a rejection of the past. It is a compromise with it. You do not destroy the place. You do not leave it exposed. You cover it. You let it remain. But you remove it from daily life. The ancestors stay. The living move on. This is a very elegant solution, and therefore suspicious. Because elegant solutions are usually things historians invent after everyone involved is dead. Real life is messier. Perhaps some people wanted closure, others did not. Perhaps a younger group wanted to reuse the stones. An older person objected. Perhaps one family wanted the enclosure maintained, another saw no reason. Perhaps practical and symbolic arguments overlapped until nobody could say which was which. Do not dismantle it. It is sacred, meaning perhaps, my family built it, or my authority depends on it, or I remember my father there, or simply, I am afraid something bad will happen. Humans rarely announce the less flattering reason. We are generous editors of our own motives. And conflict over old places can become conflict over identity. If this enclosure disappears, who are we? If that story is no longer performed, what connects us to the people before us? If those skulls are buried, who remembers their names? If the great pillars are covered, what replaces them? These are not archaeological questions. They are human questions. Every culture eventually faces them. The answer is usually change, but change rarely feels like progress while it is happening. It feels like loss, inconvenience, disagreement, something not being done properly anymore. Someone younger being disrespectful, someone older being unreasonable, a new building replacing an old one, a ritual shortened because nobody has time, a food once essential becoming ceremonial, a ceremony becoming memory, then memory becoming archaeology, and archaeology arrives far too late to hear the argument. All that remains is the fill, the stone, the cut marks, the bones, the absence. But there is another object from Göbekli Tepe that makes this absence particularly strange. Stone heads, human-like heads, separated from bodies. Some appear deliberately broken at the neck, and stone masks, faces made without people behind them. A place already dominated by faceless bodies contains faces without bodies. It is difficult not to notice the symmetry. The central pillars have presence without expression. The stone heads have expression without body. The human skull has identity without flesh. Everything seems to hover around the same boundary. What makes a person a person? The body, the face, the name, the memory, the group, the role? Perhaps the builders of Göbekli Tepe had answers. Perhaps they had stories explaining exactly what these things meant. Stories repeated so often, nobody thought they could ever disappear. And then they did. which should make us slightly less confident about our own permanence. We have cloud storage. They had stone. Neither guarantees understanding. A file can survive without context. A photograph can survive after nobody knows who is in it. A monument can survive after the language on it is forgotten. Preservation is not memory. It is only survival of material. Göbekli Tepe survived extraordinarily well in places. Its meaning did not. That may partly be because it was covered, and if people deliberately participated in that covering, there is a beautiful irony in it. They may have hidden the place from their own future and preserved it for ours. But before we decide that they were protecting memory, there is a darker possibility we have not really touched yet. Because sometimes human beings do not preserve things because they love them. Sometimes they close them because they believe they should no longer be active. A dangerous object is not always destroyed. Sometimes it is contained. A dangerous place is not always erased. Sometimes it is sealed. And if the people of Göbekli Tepe believed the enormous figures around them represented something more than stone, then filling the enclosure might have done more than end its use. It might have ended a relationship. The question is, what kind of relationship requires several tons of earth to finish? The strange thing about a face is how quickly we look for one. 2 dots and a line are enough. A pattern in stone, a stain on a wall, the front of a car, a window in a dark house. The human mind is almost embarrassingly eager to find eyes. We are built for it. Faces tell us whether another person is angry, afraid, friendly, sick, distracted, watching us, not watching us. The face is where uncertainty becomes manageable, and that makes the central pillars of Göbekli Tepe particularly uncomfortable, because they seem to be bodies, but they do not give us faces. They have arms, hands, belts, details that look like clothing. They stand upright. They occupy space like figures. The central pillars are larger than the others around them. They are not simply slabs arranged for structural convenience. They feel intentional, present, almost social. And yet where we expect eyes, there is nothing. Where we expect a mouth, nothing. No expression, no mood, no obvious identity. Just a broad horizontal top resting on a vertical shaft. A form simple enough to be geometric, and human enough to refuse to remain geometric once you notice the hands. Imagine meeting something that has every sign of being a person except the part that lets you know what it wants. That is the problem with a faceless figure. It cannot reassure you. A smiling statue tells you something. An angry statue tells you something. Even a blank human face gives you details to read. A faceless body gives nothing back. You project onto it. And projection is dangerous because it reveals more about the viewer than the object. A frightened person sees threat. A grieving person sees presence. A worshipper may see authority. A child may see something enormous and important without needing a category at all. Perhaps that is closer to how some people at Göbekli Tepe experienced these pillars. Not as statues in our sense. Not necessarily gods. Not necessarily ancestors. Not necessarily representations of known people, but beings, presences, something whose identity did not require a face. That possibility is easy to say, harder to inhabit. So imagine approaching one. You are standing close enough that the pillar rises far above your head. The limestone surface is pale. Tool marks remain in places. A carved arm descends along the side. A hand rests toward the front. The proportions are strange, not anatomically realistic, not meant to be. A belt crosses the body. Something hangs below. The figure is recognizable as embodied, but simplified. You move around it. The shape changes slightly. Light catches different edges. If there is firelight, shadows deepen the carving. If there is daylight entering from above or through an opening, the stone brightens unevenly, but there is still no face. You cannot tell whether it is looking at you. Perhaps that is the point. A being with no carved eyes can never look away. It also can never clearly look at you. The uncertainty remains permanent, and permanent uncertainty can become sacred very easily. If people returned to these figures again and again, the pillars would accumulate stories. Children might hear their names before seeing them, or perhaps the names were known only to certain people. Perhaps the figures represented people from a myth. Perhaps they represented categories of person. Perhaps they were not people at all. We do not know. And this is where modern language starts making trouble again. We want to ask, who is this? But perhaps the better question is, what kind of presence did this create? A huge upright form, human attributes, no face, surrounded by animals. That combination alone changes how a space feels. The animals at Göbekli Tepe are not placed like illustrations in a children's encyclopedia. They appear in varied positions. Some are carved in relief. Some seem active. Snakes twist. Boars stand tense. Foxes move across surfaces. Birds appear. Aurochs, gazelles, creatures whose bodies the people knew, not from diagrams, but from proximity. That matters. We look at a carved snake and see a symbol. They may also have remembered the sensation of almost stepping on one, the speed, the sudden movement, the way the body disappears into grass. A boar carved in stone is not just wildlife. A living boar can injure you very quickly. An aurochs can kill you. A predator can follow weakness. A vulture arrives where something has died. The animal world around Göbekli Tepe was not neutral. It observed people, competed with them, fed them, threatened them, warned them, marked seasons, and sometimes ate what remained after death. Perhaps the carvings drew on all of these associations, not one. That is important. We tend to demand single meanings from ancient images. Fox equals cleverness. Snake equals rebirth. Vulture equals death. It is convenient, and almost certainly too convenient. A fox can be food competitor, admired hunter, pest, story character, omen, familiar animal, clan sign, memory, joke. The same animal can mean several things in the same society. We manage this easily ourselves. A dog can represent loyalty, fear, childhood, police, hunting, home, danger. Companionship depends who is looking. Meaning is not a dictionary. It is a network, and Göbekli Tepe gives us the network without the conversation. That is why certainty becomes suspicious here. Whenever someone says a particular carving definitely means one thing, we should become slightly uncomfortable. The builders themselves may not have agreed. Different groups may have interpreted the same image differently. A symbol can unite precisely because everyone thinks it means roughly the same thing. Roughly is enough. It does not need philosophical consistency. Humans are quite capable of sharing rituals while privately disagreeing about almost everything inside them. Again, a durable tradition. Perhaps the animals functioned partly as group identities. Perhaps certain communities associated themselves with certain creatures. Perhaps carvings marked stories. events, myths, hunting relationships, dangerous forces, or simply creatures considered important enough to place in stone. Whatever the answer, the choice of animal imagery creates an atmosphere that is not soft. There are relatively few things about Göbekli Tepe that feel cozy. Even the most beautiful carvings seem alert, tense, alive, in the wrong way. And this becomes especially interesting when we consider the human figures, because the animals often have heads, faces, mouths, teeth. The central human-like pillars do not. The animal is specific. The person is abstract. It is an odd reversal. We usually imagine humans as individuals and animals as categories. A deer, a fox, a snake. But perhaps here, certain animals were highly specific, while the human-like central figures represented something larger than individuality, a type of being, an ancestor beyond a single name, a collective identity. Again, speculation, but useful speculation if we keep it honest. Now imagine that over generations, people become more familiar with the images than with the stories that created them. The carvings remain precise. The explanations drift. A child learns that a particular fox matters. Why? Because it does. A teenager asks whether the figure has a name. An older person gives one answer. Another older person gives another. The difference might not matter at first, but differences in interpretation can create factions. This is one of the quiet social dangers of inherited symbols. The older the symbol, the more people can claim authority over its meaning. And whoever controls meaning can control behavior. If I know what the pillar requires, you need me. If I know when the ritual happens, you need me. If I know who may enter, you need me. If I know what happens if the rule is broken, you may fear me. Knowledge does not have to be true to be powerful. It only has to be socially accepted. This does not mean Göbekli Tepe was controlled by manipulative priests. We do not have evidence for that sort of neat scenario. But any repeated ceremonial system creates expertise. Some people remember more. Some perform more often. Some become confident. Others become dependent on their confidence. One person says, "This is the correct way." Everyone else has to decide whether they believe them. And because the consequences of being wrong may be imagined as severe, caution favors obedience. That is how uncertainty creates authority. If nothing bad will happen when the sequence changes, experimentation is easy. If people believe something bad might happen, experimentation becomes expensive. You do not test a sacred prohibition casually. You do not say, "Perhaps the old people are wrong," and then deliberately ignore the rule right before hunting season. At least, not if the entire community will blame you if the hunt fails. Social pressure makes supernatural uncertainty very practical. The result is a system that can preserve itself. The ritual works because people perform it. They perform it because it works. If the expected event happens, success confirms the ritual. If it does not happen, perhaps someone performed it incorrectly. The system can survive both outcomes. Humans are excellent at designing beliefs with good defensive architecture, and now place those beliefs inside literal architecture. A building with restricted spaces, huge figures, dangerous animals, possibly controlled access, possibly repeated feasting, possibly handling of human remains. The physical environment reinforces the social one. If only certain people enter, their knowledge becomes harder to challenge. If people outside cannot see everything, stories grow. Secrecy is not always deliberate. Sometimes architecture creates it. A room is small, not everyone fits. A passage is narrow. A ritual requires concentration. Someone says, only 5 people inside. Practical solution. Then the same 5 categories of people enter next time. Habit. Then everyone assumes those people are the ones permitted. Tradition. Then perhaps nobody remembers the original crowding problem. Sacred restriction. There it is again. The same human loop. Temporary. Repeated. Permanent. Justified. Forgotten. If some of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures could not hold very large crowds, then at least some participation may have happened outside. That creates another unsettling picture. A larger gathering nearby. People eating, talking, waiting, and somewhere within or below, a smaller group enters the monumental space. Those outside do not see everything. Perhaps they hear something, a rhythm, voices, stone echo. Then the group emerges. What happened inside? Maybe everyone knows. Maybe everyone thinks they know. Maybe only a few know. The difference is enormous. And if access was restricted by age, status, gender, group, initiation, or some other rule, then the enclosure is not only sacred space, it becomes social sorting. Who is allowed close to the center? Who must remain near the wall? Who waits outside? Architecture makes hierarchy visible even before anyone gives it a name. A person at the center experiences the place differently from a person outside. That difference alone can create prestige, and prestige seeks permanence. If entering once gives status, people may want the rule repeated. If a family gains authority from a role, they may want their children to inherit it. A temporary responsibility becomes hereditary. A useful specialist becomes a class. We cannot say this happened at Göbekli Tepe, but this is how social systems harden. Incrementally. Nobody needs to invent inequality in a meeting. People simply repeat an arrangement that benefits some of them. Eventually, the arrangement feels natural. And once something feels natural, changing it feels disruptive. Perhaps some of the great stone figures helped legitimize those arrangements. The ancestors stand here. The order comes from them. The old way is visible in stone. Again, very convenient for whoever understands the old way. But even if there was no formal hierarchy, the emotional effect of the central pillars remains. Something is bigger than you. Something was here before you. Something will remain after you. That idea alone humbles, and maybe frightens. Large objects have always been good at producing authority. A cathedral ceiling, a palace hall, a monumental statue, a courthouse staircase. Scale changes behavior. You lower your voice. You become aware of your body. You notice how small you are. Göbekli Tepe may have done this deliberately. Or perhaps monumentality began for other reasons and people discovered the effect afterward. Another temporary solution, becoming a tradition. Make the pillar large because the stone allows it. People respond strongly. Next pillar is large too. Eventually, size becomes part of meaning. We often assume symbolism precedes construction. Sometimes construction creates symbolism. A practical choice produces an emotional effect. The emotional effect is remembered, then repeated intentionally. Human culture learns from accidents. Perhaps this is how some of the strangest traditions begin. An unusual event happens once. People remember it because it was unusual. They repeat the context, hoping to repeat the outcome. Soon the accident becomes ritual. Imagine a successful hunt after a particular gathering. The next year, people repeat some of the same actions. Again, successful. Now, coincidence has a pattern. 10 generations later, nobody remembers the first hunt, only the correct ceremony. And if somebody suggests changing it, people become uncomfortable. Not because they are irrational, because accumulated memory feels like evidence. This is another reason Göbekli Tepe may have mattered during a period of ecological and social change. Traditions stabilize uncertainty. They tell people what to do when the environment cannot. The rainfall shifts, animals move, people settle longer, food sources change. The old ritual says, do this. Even if nobody knows whether it works, doing something together reduces fear. Collective action turns private anxiety into public order. That alone can make ritual useful, and useful rituals are hard to abandon. Which raises the question again. What would make people stop? If these enclosures mattered enough to build, repair, decorate, return to, perhaps restrict, perhaps connect to ancestors and feasts, why let them disappear? Maybe the answer is not that belief weakened. Maybe the opposite. Maybe the spaces became too charged to leave unfinished. The idea of a sacred place becoming dangerous is not unusual in human societies. Sacred does not always mean safe. A powerful object can heal and harm. A shrine can be approached only under certain conditions. A tomb can be revered and feared. An ancestor can protect and punish. A deity can bless and destroy. Power is often ambivalent. That is almost its defining feature. If something is only good, you do not fear mishandling it. If something can respond unpredictably, rules matter. Do not enter without preparation. Do not touch. Do not speak the name. Do not move the object. Do not perform the act at the wrong time. Do not disturb the dead. And whenever a culture develops many rules around a thing, outsiders tend to interpret the rules as fear. Sometimes correctly, sometimes not. Respect and fear overlap, especially around things people cannot control. Perhaps the builders saw the central pillars this way, perhaps not. But the imagery surrounding them does little to reduce the possibility. Dangerous creatures, predators, snakes, boars, birds associated in later interpretations with death, human heads, human bones. The whole symbolic environment seems concerned with boundaries, human and animal, living and dead, body and face, inside and outside, visible and hidden. And boundaries become particularly important when categories feel unstable. Death is the ultimate unstable boundary. A person becomes a body, but the identity does not disappear at the same speed. Everyone still recognizes the face. Then the face changes. Later only bone. At what point is the person gone? Modern biology offers one answer. Human emotion offers many. Perhaps prehistoric ritual helped manage this slow separation. The body changes before memory does. The skull remains after the face is gone. The name remains after the skull is buried. Then eventually, the name disappears. The pillar may have represented a solution to this. Stone body, no face to decay, no individual expression, permanent presence. If you want to make a human-like being that outlives people, remove the fragile parts. Stone does not rot. A faceless figure does not age. It never looks sick, never closes its eyes, never changes mood, never becomes unrecognizable. It is almost a perfect ancestor. If it is an ancestor, we cannot know. But the psychological logic is interesting. A human body is temporary. A stone body is not. At least it feels that way until the stone cracks, until the wall shifts, until rain enters, until the ground moves. And then even the supposedly permanent figure becomes vulnerable. Imagine seeing one of these pillars damaged. Maybe part of the carving breaks. Maybe a structure collapses nearby. Maybe the pillar tilts. Suddenly, the thing representing permanence requires support from ordinary people. That inversion could be deeply unsettling. You thought the pillar held meaning. Now you are holding the pillar. You thought the enclosure protected something. Now you are building a retaining wall to protect the enclosure. The sacred system begins depending visibly on human maintenance. That can create a crisis. If a powerful being requires you to keep rainwater out of its room, how powerful is it? People have solved versions of this contradiction in many ways. The sacred object is not weak. The people are being tested. The damage is a warning. The ritual was incorrect. The community failed. The event has meaning. Humans rarely allow important things to become meaningless by accident. Meaning rushes in, and disaster accelerates it. A crack in a normal wall is a repair. A crack in a sacred wall can become a message. Again, we do not know whether people at Göbekli Tepe interpreted it that way. But if they did, closure becomes easier to imagine. Perhaps a damaged enclosure was not repaired because damage itself changed its status. The place had been marked, finished. Its time was over. Then filling it might have been less, like hiding, and more like obeying. Or perhaps filling was protection. You cover the carvings so no one else can misuse them. You conceal an old space from outsiders. You keep powerful objects inaccessible. You bury the place because leaving it open invites interference. This interpretation is tempting because humans often control power through restriction. If everyone can touch something, it becomes ordinary. If nobody can touch it, importance grows. Scarcity again. Perhaps the ultimate restriction is burial. No one enters. No one changes the carvings. No one reuses the pillar. No rival group claims the space. No curious child wanders inside. No careless person breaks the rule. The site becomes safe because it becomes inaccessible. Safe for whom is another question. For the people? For the object? For the dead? For the social order? Maybe all of them. But burial can also be a way to neutralize. You do not preserve the dangerous thing because you love it. You preserve it because destroying it feels even more dangerous. This is a very old human instinct. An object is feared. Breaking it might release something. Throwing it away might offend something. So you contain it, place it somewhere controlled, seal it, cover it, avoid it. Even modern people do small versions of this with emotionally charged objects. A box in a closet, a letter never opened again, a photograph turned face down, an old possession packed away because throwing it out feels wrong. You do not want it present. You also cannot destroy it, so it remains in a suspended state, hidden, preserved, removed from daily life. Burial is the largest version of that gesture. And perhaps this is where the phrase, "What were they hiding from?" becomes most interesting. Maybe they were hiding from the emotional consequences of destruction, not from a monster, not from an enemy, from guilt, from fear of breaking continuity, from the possibility that ending the old system openly would be too difficult. Covering solves the contradiction. The place remains, but not accessible. The tradition survives physically, but not operationally. You have not destroyed the ancestors. You have simply placed them below. This is almost too human. We do it with institutions as well. A rule no longer makes sense. Instead of abolishing it, we stop enforcing it. A room is no longer used. We lock it. A ceremony feels obsolete. We perform it less often. A relationship is over. Nobody says so directly. Distance increases until the relationship exists only in memory. Humans are often more comfortable with gradual disappearance than explicit endings. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe's enclosures entered that kind of social twilight. Still important, less used, still remembered, harder to maintain, still sacred. Increasingly inconvenient, then damage, then sediment, then closure. Not one decision, 1,000 small withdrawals. The question, who buried Göbekli Tepe, may therefore have no single answer. Rain did some, gravity did some, collapse did some, people may have done some, time did the rest. And yet specific objects found in fills make pure accident difficult to accept in every case. Stone heads, fragments placed in meaningful positions, human remains, material that looks selected, or at least handled. This suggests moments when people were not merely tolerating natural burial, they were participating. And participation changes the emotional character of the process. There is a difference between watching a room slowly fill with dirt and carrying dirt into it. The first is neglect. The second is action. If they acted, why? Perhaps to stabilize, perhaps to dispose of debris, perhaps to close, perhaps to protect, perhaps to neutralize. Perhaps because the place had become dangerous physically, or socially, or symbolically. And now the animal carvings become relevant again. Because if the imagery represents dangerous forces, perhaps enclosing them mattered. Look at a snake carved in stone. It cannot move, of course. But symbolic systems do not depend on physical movement. A flag cannot command soldiers. A wedding ring cannot enforce fidelity. Money is paper. A courtroom robe is fabric. Humans give inert objects behavioral power. The object changes what people do. A snake carved on a pillar can be powerful if people respond to it. The stone does not need belief. The people do. Perhaps the creatures carved at Göbekli Tepe operated in a similar way. Not as magical objects, necessarily, as social triggers. See this. Remember this story. Behave this way. Avoid that. Honor this group. Fear that event. The carving is storage for cultural instruction. No writing required. And visual memory can be remarkably durable. A child can recognize a symbol before understanding its meaning. They grow into the meaning. This may have allowed stories to survive across generations, but it also creates another problem. The symbol can survive after the story changes. A carved snake remains a snake, but whether it means danger, rebirth, ancestry, season, or group identity may drift. Eventually, someone interprets it differently. Now, the same pillar supports competing meanings. Conflict again. Ancient monuments can become contested because they are too durable. People change faster than stone. That may be one reason societies sometimes destroy old monuments. A new system does not want the old symbols standing visibly, but Göbekli Tepe does not appear to have been simply smashed flat. Much survives. That suggests, at least in some cases, a different relationship. Cover rather than erase. Retire rather than annihilate. And covering is respectful destruction. You remove function while preserving form, like closing the eyes of the dead. The body remains. Access ends. This image may be useful, not as fact, as emotional analogy. An enclosure filled with material slowly loses its interior. The walls are still there, the pillars still stand, but the room is gone. No one can gather inside. The architecture has a body, but no usable space. It becomes, in a sense, another kind of corpse. Shape remains, function ends. And if human death rituals influenced how people understood endings, perhaps architectural closure borrowed from the same emotional logic. Again, we cannot prove it, but the parallel is hard to ignore, especially at a site where human remains, skull modification, monumental human-like figures, and possible deliberate closure intersect. The uncomfortable part is that none of these elements needs to be sinister. We keep looking for a horror story because burial feels suspicious. But perhaps this was care. Care can look violent archaeologically. A skull cut after death can be reverence. A building filled with rubble can be respect. A statue deliberately broken can be ritual release. Our emotional categories do not fossilize, so we have to hold several possibilities at once. And that is difficult. We prefer villains, catastrophes, secrets, a thing they were hiding from. But maybe the most accurate answer is a collection of ordinary fears. Fear of weather, fear of hunger, fear of social breakdown, fear of offending the dead, fear of changing tradition, fear of leaving a damaged sacred place unresolved, fear that the old rules no longer work, fear that the new world does not yet have rules. That last one may be the most important, because the people of Göbekli Tepe were living through change. Settlements were becoming more permanent. Food strategies were shifting. People were learning how to live closer together for longer periods. And living together permanently creates problems. Mobile life can sometimes escape. You cannot simply walk away from an unpleasant neighbor if your stored grain is here. You cannot abandon every disagreement if your house is here. You cannot move easily when fields, buildings, graves, and obligations hold you. Permanence increases friction. The same settlement that provides security creates confinement. The same storage that protects against hunger creates theft. The same surplus that allows feasting creates inequality. The same specialization that improves skill creates dependence. The same sacred center that unites people creates competition over control. Every solution develops a shadow. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe stood near the beginning of some of these shadows, not as the cause, as part of a world discovering them. A world in which humans were becoming better at organizing large groups and simultaneously creating new reasons to distrust each other. If one group brings more food, do they deserve more influence? If one lineage knows the rituals, should they control the site? If one person organizes labor successfully, do they lead only today or next year too? If a role repeats, does it become inherited? If resources are stored, who guards them? If someone steals, what happens? If a dispute cannot be solved by separating and moving away, what replaces distance? Rules, authority, punishment, compromise, tradition, and perhaps sacred legitimacy. A society becoming more settled must invent ways to make people tolerate one another. This may be one of civilization's least glamorous origins. Not grand philosophy, crowd management. How do you keep 20 families from fighting over water? How do you decide who works on the wall? How do you distribute meat? How do you manage outsiders? How do you stop someone taking stored food? How do you respond when someone refuses? The answers can become customs. Customs become rules. Rules become institutions. And institutions often borrow authority from older things. Ancestors, sacred places, traditional stories. Because do this because I say so is weak. Do this because this is how our people have always done it is stronger. Put that rule next to an ancient pillar and it becomes stronger still. The past is a powerful argument because it cannot answer questions. But what happens when the past itself becomes inconvenient? Perhaps that is where Göbekli Tepe eventually found itself. The old place legitimized order, but the new social world required different arrangements. The site may have become less central as settlement patterns changed. New communal buildings appeared elsewhere. New traditions, new centers. A sacred institution can lose practical relevance long before people become willing to say it aloud. So people keep maintaining it for a while. Then maintenance decreases. Then use becomes occasional. Then symbolic. Then nobody wants to destroy it, so they close it. If intentional closure happened this way, the thing they were hiding from may have been remarkably familiar. Change. Not sudden change, the slow kind. The kind nobody votes for. The kind that happens while everyone insists nothing fundamental is different. Then one day, the old building no longer belongs to the living world, and someone carries the first basket of fill inside. Perhaps everyone understands what that means. Perhaps nobody says it. The material falls onto the floor. Dust rises, and the figure in the center remains expressionless. Of course it does. It has no face. Maybe that made the work easier, or perhaps much harder. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about Göbekli Tepe so far. The stones were difficult to raise, difficult to maintain, and increasingly difficult to understand. Yet people kept returning to them. But eventually, something changed. Because at some point, maintaining these ancient spaces was no longer enough. Earth began to enter them, deliberately or otherwise, and pillars that had stood in the open for generations slowly began to disappear. In the next part of our journey, we'll return to the hill at that strange turning point when people stopped simply caring for Göbekli Tepe and began leaving parts of it beneath the earth. Until then, rest well. The hill will still be here when we return.